to welcome you all this morning to this session in which we are going to talk about a bit of the more serious part of these issues that we included in the questions of the quiz. This panel is panel 3 of the Policy Forum, the private finance agenda post FfD4. How do we stop the Titanic from hitting the iceberg? Question mark. That's the sense of the panel that we have ahead of us. And it's a pleasure for me to welcome you all. My name is Maria Jose Romero, and I work for Eurodad, leading the development finance team, and we have been working on these issues for long with many of you in the room and also in the virtual room. And today we want to recap, or we want to map where we are with this agenda, think about what is a hopeful vision for this agenda for all of us. We want to hear some of the implications of this agenda for civil society, for people on the ground, for a justice-based and a rights-based agenda. We want to see also and discuss what opportunities are for us to work on these issues going forward. And for that, we have a panel composed of friends, of experts that have been working on these issues for long as well, from their different perspectives, their different angles, and we all want to hear from them and discuss. So I will introduce the 4 speakers and the dynamics of the panel, and then I will give them the floor one by one. So we have with us Daniela Gabor, who is a professor of economics at SOAS, University of London. She has been with us and leading this work, and we are very grateful that she can join us online. We have Iggy Sandrino from Yvonne International. He's based in the Philippines, and Yvonne has been a partner of Eurodad and many of us in this room in our work on these issues. So thank you very much for joining us. Today, we have Hamdi Ben-Sama from ActionAid International, based here in Brussels, and it's great to have you here with us and with me in the physical room with you all. And then we have Karabo, I'm sorry, I am really sorry, Mok-Onyana. I am sorry, and I hope that I have pronounced your surname fine. You come from PowerShift Africa, and it's great to have you here with us today because we do want to explore what are the implications of this agenda for an energy transition perspective from an African perspective, and it's great to include your reflections and your work in our discussion. So each of the panelists will have 10 minutes to answer some of the initial questions that we included in our concept note, and then we will open the floor for you all to ask questions, share your reflections, and then the colleagues in the panel will have a final chance to also respond to the other panelists' remarks and engage with the questions and the comments from the audience. And we will run the whole conversation for 1 hour and 5 minutes, right? Okay, let's go with this program. Now I will give the floor to Daniela, who will have her 10 minutes to address the points on FfD4 in relation to private finance. What are the implications? What are the possible alternatives? How in the private finance, how FfD4 has deepened the private finance push that we have seen for more than 10 years. Daniela, the floor is yours. Welcome again.
Thank you, Maria Jose, and good morning to everybody. This was very exciting. I found the Romanian competitive spirit in me racing ahead. I actually didn't know that the PSIs had increased by that much, so this will stay with me in that question. I want to say three things about where are we a year after FfD4, after Sevilla, and to think about these three things, I want to remind people in the room that in the shift to private finance, at least since Addis Abeba, I think of it as a development paradigm. The World Bank called it a development paradigm, not thinking about or trying to call for a shift in the kind of institutions and mindsets of how the World Bank did development. And I call this development paradigm the Wall Street consensus to capture the importance not just of the turn to private finance, but of new development actors that have specific political agendas in pushing them in development spaces. Now, if we think of this as a development paradigm, that a shift from the Washington consensus that we know towards the Wall Street consensus, and if we think how development paradigms evolve over time, I want to think with Tandika Mkandawire, the Malawian economist. He told us that we should think about paradigms at national or international level as an ideology, a structure nexus. As in, there has to be an ideological work done in order to create consensus around this paradigm, and there has to be a structural element which allows this particular paradigm to be implemented, to be put in practice. So at Seville, or in Sevilla, what we saw is that the ideological component of the Wall Street consensus of the privatizing private finance mobilization, it's still very powerful, even if the United States was not in the room, even if the fracturing of multilateralism was there, the Europeans and others were very clear of the imperative to continue to mobilize private capital. Since then, I've been in an expert panel at the OECD on the future of development cooperation, and there is very little effort spent on anything else but thinking through how do we create de-risking capacity. And this is where I think it's important. So remember, the ideological structure paradigm of the ideology structure nexus of a development paradigm says that you also have to have capacity to deliver on the ideological commitments. And this is where we see the problem with mobilizing private finance, where there are inherent tensions and contradictions in this development paradigm that make it a weak development paradigm, as in it cannot mobilize private capital. And we heard this in Seville very clearly. It cannot mobilize private capital because it's so badly aligned with development outcomes. The de-risking capacity that is necessary both at multilateral level from World Bank and other development finance institutions and at local level, it simply creates too much political conflict that erupts in backlash, and it's difficult to generate the kinds of trillions simply because of this fundamental contradiction in the mobilizing private capital story, this contradiction between public purpose or development purpose and private profit. It's very clear there, and the efforts to build, to me, de-risking capacity are trying to grapple with this. But if we think, for example, of the scandals in Kenya around purchasing power agreements, if we think about the scandals across the African continent, if we think about Vietnam's renegotiation of the terms of purchasing agreements in energy, we see that in order to mobilize at scale, we would need local fiscal resources that are simply not available. So this paradigm will never deliver structurally. And this is very important when your colleague, I don't know who it was, so apologies that this is not a small critique. When your colleague said that the first question, scandalous, that only 30 cents were mobilized on every public dollar, I say, great. I don't want much more mobilization. What happens if it's $2? It means $2 of privatized public goods. This is the important thing that civil society has won in Sevilla, to point out that the mobilizing private finance discourse is a discourse of injustice, is a discourse of privatization, is the same neoliberal paradigm wrapped in, a clause of necessity. So I don't think for me, it's not scandalous. For me, it's great. I worry if they mobilize $10 for every public dollar spent, because it means those $10 are coming from public budgets. To mobilize so much private finance, it means that the local governments across countries in the global south are directing more and more resources towards subsidizing private assets, particularly infrastructure assets. So I'm grateful. I wish that number was smaller. The smaller it is, the better in terms of development outcomes. We know that they are trying to make this number bigger with attempts to build de-risking capacity. The World Bank's guarantee platform is there, the country platforms, the OECD is putting a lot of effort into this. DFIs, I've heard DFI strategizing around how to organize their KPIs around increasing de-risking capacity. The concessions you won in Sevilla are gone, as in the recognition that you have to align with development outcome. Nobody's actually doing this in practice. It will continue to be de-risking, mobilizing. Now, the second point, while the Wall Street consensus is very powerful ideologically, and there are attempts that I don't think will be very successful to scale up de-risking capacity at national level, what we see is the Trump administration is also now back into the Wall Street consensus mode with the Development Finance Corporation that is explicitly using development aid or development funds of the United States government for investable AI. I think this is where we have to be very careful. There is a geopolitical reorientation of the Wall Street consensus towards great power politics in AI. And the DFC is very clear. Pax Silica also, I don't know if there is anybody in the room from Philippines. It would be very interesting to discuss what this means in terms of sovereignty. But the Trump administration is pushing an investable AI agenda. We saw in Kenya what this means. It's pushing governments to agree to something called compute purchase agreements now, a kind of upscaling of the purchase power agreements in energy. What they're saying is you have to buy our AI stack. The Trump administration is developing a set of de-risking subsidies for US AI companies to export the entire AI stack to countries in the global south, with very clear conditions around, if you buy from us, you can't buy from China. So there is a push for digital colonialization now through the new iteration of the Wall Street consensus that should worry us a lot, because this will go to the heart of governments if it happens. I don't think it will happen because it has the same problems that the old Wall Street consensus has, which is you need a fuckload of money to be able to buy these things, because this is how the United States organizes its de-risking agreements, and China AI stack is cheaper. But there is clearly an extension towards AI, and we should be paying attention, because I don't know what happens once American big tech firms are inside the global South states and governments, implementation and operational frameworks. And I'm going to finish with this. I think, and I know in the room, I accept that in the room there might be some misgivings about the discourse of economic sovereignty and what it means. But I think there is an opportunity now, since Mark Carney's speech, at least a very clear public opportunity. There is an opportunity for us to push back against de-risking, to push back against mobilizing private finance, because there is a greater recognition everywhere that economic sovereignty, food sovereignty, energy sovereignty are very important, even AI sovereignty. And why is this an opportunity for me? It's an opportunity because, to me, the Wall Street consensus, as the Washington consensus, was also a strategy of US hegemony that relied and pushed and was built on capital mobility and reducing the role of the state to ensuring that capital can move freely within and across borders. I think this is an opportunity now, because this US hegemonic strategy is not working very well. And since it's not working very well, we have to think again about what can we do in a world where where local politicians are more willing to talk about building national capacity for, energy sovereignty or food sovereignty. I don't have great illusions, as in we understand that local politics is complicated, but the fact that everybody now accepts that there has to be some kind of transformative politics, even for, surviving in a world of Israeli, US, petro wars, etc., etc. To me, it's an opening, and it's an opening to start thinking about what kind of things we want to ask for. I mean, as an economist, I want to ask for capital controls. I want to ask for the state to take over public services again. I want to ask for the state to reduce its obsessions with private capital mobilization. I want to ask for a change in the institutional architecture of the state. So there are many things that I want to ask for, which I'm sure are not exactly overlapping with the things that you in the room would want to ask for, but as a precondition to get a different kind of development trajectory, I think we need to take advantage of this moment of greater pursuit of economic sovereignty to say what kind of state do we want, and how can the state forget about partnerships with BlackRock or partnerships with some sovereign fund of the United Arab Emirates, and think about what kind of economic sovereignty can we build if we change our institutions. It's a very hard task. I'm not super optimistic, but optimism of the will, pessimism of the intellect. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Daniela. It was great, and it was very, very insightful. Getting your perspective on the development paradigm and how the ideological component of the Wall Street consensus is and was present, very much present in Sevilla. To your final point on economic sovereignty. And I think that probably you flagged that probably between the room and your views, we are not so much aligned, but let's see later on. I do think that there might be some points from colleagues in the room to share and to get more from you on what are the proposals that you want to see and to push for, and what are the ones that do resonate with us. With that, let's go to Iti Sandrino from Ibon International. I think that you have been doing quite a lot of work precisely on that, on what could be the possible alternatives, and also what are the implications and an impact on the ground of this agenda. So over to you, Iti.
Thank you. Thank you so much, MJ. I hope I'm audible. Thank you for having us. It's nice to be here. It would have been nicer to be there, but we work with what we have. Thank you as well to Daniela for um, um, your inputs. I'd like to answer right away the question on the PAC Silica and what it means for us. Basically, what it just means is more war, more extraction of the critical minerals needed for war, and an even more intensification of the hegemonic rule of, especially of the US in our region, in our part of the world. Um, you actually went over much of the financing for development um, issues. You took a load off of my shoulders a bit. Um, but what I want to focus on is, I guess, just a few points, a little bit more about the FFD forum and its outcomes. Uh, Namely, that I guess what I want to share is that the this is also happening. The admission that the private sector dynamism has slowed, and that the private investment remains highly concentrated in a few sectors, This is also happening while the OECD countries are also failing in their ODA obligations to countries in the global south. Now, the OECD itself claims that even with the large volume of private finance flowing into developing countries, it's still not enough. It will never be enough. Um, that amount, the needed amount to achieve any significant and sustainable development be will not materialize even with the flow of private finance into developing countries. And despite the repeated failures of finance capital in the private sector, which actually lumps large corporations with micro, small, and medium enterprises, the outcome document of the Sevilla compromise, it still relies on the private sector and tries to force them to contribute to development that they have largely so far failed to do. And we need to recognize that the current framework of the macroeconomic global governance remains neoliberal and neocolonial. And for the past 40 years, it's failed to deliver the commitments that it said it would to address the gaps in financing sustainable development. Um, so Danielle already mentioned um, the caveat that FDIs must align to the investment priorities of the developing countries. Which brings me to my second point that on one hand, this is all happening while there is an ongoing shift towards protectionism in the north. But on the other hand, northern-based institutions are continuously peddling the neoliberal agenda of exporting their surplus capital to and extracting even more resources from the global south. And I say this because of the two policy agendas that the World Bank is currently peddling. Firstly, the industrial policy agenda. Recently, just this March, the World Bank released this publication, which basically says that industrial policy is back, right? And in the midst of an economic crisis that's also due to the continuous slowdown in global manufacturing, the World Bank comes up with this policy idea that seemingly contradicts 4 decades of neoliberal agenda peddling. Now, it aims to push developing countries to develop their own industries, something that the IMF and the World Bank discouraged and vilified for the past 40 years. While this seems to contradict past policy directions, in reality, the document actually reveals that it still follows the same old approach of creating suitable, conducive environments for businesses and directing the integration of domestic economies into global supply chains, thereby pushing really developing countries into just being suppliers of raw materials and cheap labor. uh, And it's the same decade-old patterns that define um, the current framework for industrialization that the World Bank is attempting to sell to us in the global south. And it's still within the grounds of neoliberal doctrine. Um, for the global south, what the World Bank means by industrial policy in the 21st century is actually or has always meant the erosion of labor rights, the displacement of peasants and indigenous peoples from their lands. Um, which brings me to my next point, because in line with the industrial policy agenda, it's also trying to sell us the World Bank the World Bank is also trying to sell us the jobs agenda, which has three pillars. No? First, investing in infrastructure and creating pro-business policies, and lastly, mobilizing private capital. And it goes in line with the narrative that the private sector, again, lumped into as both small businesses and large corporations. No? For them to generate most of the jobs needed by the global market. And this leaves the government with the task of creating enabling environments for business to thrive and create a population that is aligned with job market needs. But this whole narrative, again, it neglects social services as rights, labor rights, union rights. Um, it evades the discussion of the violations of corporations done in the name of good business climates. So actually, for the World Bank, it isn't really so much an issue of the quality of jobs, but more of an issue of how to generate more profit from the billions of workers located in the global south, both in the formal and informal sectors, uh, given as well the industrial policy agenda that it is peddling. And uh, lastly, I want to point out before I go on to how do we go about the current condition that we're in. Let's not forget that private capital and the international financial institutions throughout history, they've been complicit in wars and the violation of international law and human rights. Private institutions like what Daniela's mentioned a while ago, um, located in the global north, such as BlackRock, Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, no? They've all had roles in the genocide in Palestine. No? In Europe, there are over 1,000 European financial institutions that are involved in financing more than 100 companies that are contributing to the illegal occupation in Palestine. Um, Throughout history, the IFIs have supported dictatorships. Um, just recently, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank is have involved themselves in the US-led Gaza Board of Peace. Uh, so the private and just a few weeks ago or a few months ago, the private sector is yet again rearing its ugly head, by jumping on the opportunity to build on top of the ruins of Gaza, and by through the proposed master plan, new Gaza master plan, which aims to establish commercial, industrial, and tourist zones, in Palestinian lands. Even the United Nations Special Rapporteur has reported that with the implication of several corporations, including um, many of the corporations in the global north, uh, they may no longer just be implicated in occupation. They may actually be embedded in in an economy of genocide, right? Um, and so there was mention a while ago of sovereign economy and industrialization, and nations pushing towards a more um, national approach to development, instead of just relying on foreign investments and the private sector. I think what we have to recognize that um, in spite of the crisis of multilateralism, in spite of the growing aggression by a few superpowers, namely in the US, Russia, and China, the competition that's happening between them, um, international cooperation remains crucial to enable the restructuring of economic relations. For us, for social movements, especially in the global south and even in the global north, anti-imperialist unities really and solidarity for our ongoing struggles for people's rights and sovereignty. Those all remain important. Okay? As for the talk about industrialization, about it being back as a possible step towards development. The World Bank has its own version. Um, we should have our own version of what truly an industrialization that's led by the people means. Because development, we can't ever rely on the fragmented and profit-driven private capital, particularly when it's aligned with short-term speculative interests. We can't rely on them to generate coherent and long-term transformation. Development can't come from imperialist war either, from occupation, most definitely not from the same institutions that have placed the developing world in a state of chronic crisis. So there needs to be a deepening of our analysis of the IMF and the World Bank and the larger international financial architecture, which largely directs our current global economic and trade relations. We need to dare to imagine a world where such institutions that allow private interests to take precedence over public welfare, a world where they no longer exist. Instead, we take the necessary steps today to de-link from the exploitative and the extractive dominance of private finance. And I think I'll end by saying that the financing gap really is ultimately a problem resulting from the accumulation of wealth by the few, not just the few individuals, also the few powerful imperialist countries that dominate the world. So in the long run, we need to be able to realize a world that's free from the dictates of the current system, where it's governed not by capital, but by the principles of justice and respect for each and every nation's sovereignty. I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for these very powerful words. It's very important for us to hear your perspective on these issues, because we are in the process of discussing the next 5-year strategy for Eurodad. In this room, we have Eurodad and its partners in the north, but also some colleagues are here from the global south. This is a collective struggle, and we do have to reflect on the points that you are putting on the table. With this in mind, let's go to Hamdi. I have him here by my side. And with Hamdi and Karabo going next, we are going to hear and get their points on how this agenda is being translated on very specific initiatives happening at the European level, but also at the level of energy transition, the climate agenda, and think about the implications of all of that. So with that, Hamdi, the floor is yours.
Super, thanks a lot. So hi everyone, and thanks a lot for the invitation. I'm Hamdi Ben Samuel, Action Aid International, and indeed I'm EU Advocacy Advisor. So I'll try to focus. So I have a short presentation and try to focus on basically how the EU is sort of shifting towards that de-risking model that colleagues were talking about, and that private sector-led development paradigms. And actually, the EU has been sort of at the forefront of this shift. So we see it in international spaces, but we see it more importantly in the EU development architecture in itself. So here, basically, I put like 4 tables that reflects the evolution of blended finance in the EU development budget for the past, basically, since 2007, so almost 20 years. So the EU has these 7-year budget cycles for some weird historical reasons, but this is how it works. And so blending in the form of guarantees, first for the EIB for its external activities, was introduced back in the 90s, but we see a real sort of progressive introduction of blending in the EU budget from 2007. So it starts with basically 1 trust funds for infrastructure in Africa. So very isolated, very limited budget. That was introduced by the Commission in 2007 with the support of member states, obviously. Actually, the EIB has like a sort of more distinct historical role because it had its own guarantee for much longer. But basically here, what that visual is supposed to reflect is how blended finance was scaled up in the EU budget. So especially in terms of guarantees, so you start with like basically a guarantee capacity of 30 billion. And for the next budget proposal, it's being negotiated at the moment, so but it's probably going to be around. So it's basically 3-fold more. And same thing with basically the blending facility. So basically the EU has, when it does investment grants, and so it has basically specific facilities for dispersing grants in the form of blending, mostly investment grants, yeah, basically other sorts as well. And then, so here as well, you see an increase. So basically it goes from, 2 billion, 3, 4 billion. And now basically the current budget, the 2 billion figure is just like the 2 first years of implementation. So it's probably going to be increasing 2 or 3-fold from the 2007. And beyond the scaling up of basically grants and public budget resources being mobilized towards private sector-led development interventions, it's also mainstreamed in the budget. So blended started in the EU budget. There's like dedicated facilities outside the budget, and now it's mainstream, and it sort of shape also the policy outcomes and the kind of interventions that the EU program over the 7-year cycle. So yeah, this graph was meant to show that it's both scaled up, mainstreamed, and sort of now, determining the way the EU plans its development interventions. The second slide shows that, the third slide, sorry. The third slide shows, the next one, please. That basically this progressive scale up and mainstreaming has been, and that basically speaks to the point of Daniela Gabo earlier, which says that the de-risking model is actually a very weak development paradigm, because in the EU, interestingly, all basically the blending facilities and the guarantees under the EU budget are subject to regular evaluations and reviews from basically independent bodies and from the European Court of Auditors. And systematically, those reviews and evaluations have showed basically the limits of basically blending as a financing modality and as a paradigm of development policy in the EU. So one of the key lens of the evaluation is basically to assess the financial additionality. And systematically, it finds that basically the financial additionality is very limited. So you have it from the first EIB basically mandate to the more recently and upgraded open architecture under the EU budget. So basically, the court has systematically found and the evaluation have systematically questioned how much private finance is crowded in at the end of the day, how much basically additional finance is mobilized altogether. And this is systematic. And interestingly, that started in 2007. And then in the next budget, what you have is basically an increased guarantee. And you have exactly the same evaluation in 2014 that prepares the next budget, and then you have exactly the same scaled up in mainstreaming. So additionality, so the financial additionality, so all those are basically quotes from the evaluation reports. So you have the question of additionality, but also of development impact. So the sort of mandate given to the blending instruments and the EU budget are actually quite good. I mean, under NDC, you have like very strong provisions in the regulation that ask for not only for the financing to be additional, but also that request basically those financing to be in line with the policy objectives, which are otherwise actually aligned with SDGs and quite strong in terms of wording. And then you have like basically evaluation that finds that the evaluation doesn't sufficiently cover contributions to the overall objective. So actually it's consistent in the evaluations that they don't even assess the alignment of the use of guarantees and blending with the policy outcomes defined in the regulation. And this last column is basically for the next MFF, because most of you know that the EU budget is now being negotiated for the 2034 cycle, and basically same thing. You have a report from 2024 that shows the limits of lending, and then basically it's further expanded. So yeah, I wanted to do these two tables that to explain actually what Daniela Gabor was saying is that it's a weak development outcome because it basically triggers competing, I mean, it triggers political challenges between the profit-seeking approach of the private sector and the sort of political nature of development challenges. And this is fundamentally what these reports show, is that basically blending is not delivering. And interestingly, the EU keeps on increasing it. So yeah, next slide, please. Just here, in terms of still focusing on the EU, I just want to get back to actually COP29. Was it COP29? Yeah, in Baku. So basically, as many of you know, is that so the NCQG, the new collective quantified goal, the climate finance goal, basically was being negotiated for years to land at COP29, and indeed it landed the worst way possible, I suppose, but it still landed. And here, this slide is basically based on an investigative journalist from the Netherlands who requested access to documents in the Netherlands to basically understand what the Netherlands strategy as part of the EU negotiating bloc was in terms of approaching and preparing the negotiation of this bloc. And it's very interesting because we all experienced that in the climate finance negotiations, but here is basically a journalist who found the documents that substantiate our take. But how private finance was actually effectively used to basically limit the ambition of that new goal, which was supposed to be centered around the provision of public finance. And basically they did that in two ways, beyond the accounting tricks, which make them look like as a tripling, whereas it's just inflation adjusted figures, is basically through private finance. So they created a new sort of private finance, they called it the onions. It was basically in layers. So they saw the public provision as the core, and then the extra layer of the onions being private finance and the rest. But interestingly here, and I think that's why I wanted to come back to that, is that so you see the EU sort of buying in that paradigm, but you see also, and COP29 is a very good example, how the EU uses that cynically in international negotiations to basically get rid of its obligation. I mean, you can argue that the political change domestically reflect the same dynamic. But basically with the EU, so while officially being a climate leader and like portraying itself as a climate leader, where climate finance is a central element to the convention, cynically basically uses private finance to undermine policy outcomes at the end and the ambition of the convention. Am I too long now?
No, yes,
okay.
It's fine if it's like.
No, but yeah, I mean, we will have questions, but basically all this leads us, so now, there is a broader conversation here in Brussels because basically, I mean, we had that conversation already, but beyond the sort of what shapes the financing model of development policy, you have a question about the relevance, the political relevance of the development policy. I mean, from EU stakeholders, from EU policymakers in the first place. And obviously we should be critical towards that. But what I'm trying to point to is that instead of the de-risking model, what we might have is just much less ODA and like a very diluted development policy at the end of the day. And so I think, yeah, basically there are two levels of like sort of action or reflection for us is that, yes, we need to sort of fight and show basically the evidence gap in terms of development impact for blended finance in EU external interventions, but we also need to sort of make the political case for the development policy and the relevance of development policy as part of, yeah, I mean, the colleagues described the international order as it is standing now and its contradiction and its violence. But I think we need to create that story within the EU to say that, well, development policy is beyond, you know, private sector-led development is. And we have to create that political story because basically what is going to happen with the next MFF and what is happening already is quite scary. I mean, they don't even hide about the fact that the development policy is not a development policy anymore. It's a broader external action instrument that uses explicitly ODA to serve explicitly other objectives. So we are in a situation where we need to defend the relevance of international cooperation and development in the first place.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Shanti. It was very, very good to put the EU lens in this conversation. I think that you avoided the name of the flagship project, which is the Global Gateway. So you delivered the whole presentation without naming the beast. But it's very important for us to put a name on the beast. It's a Global Gateway strategy, which is the one that exemplifies quite a lot of the things that Daniela, Edith, yourself have described. So without further ado, let's go to Carabo and let's get into the promotion of private finance in the context of energy transition, because we do want to hear more about all of these to have a full package and go into some of your remarks, your questions. So Carabo, over to you. Thank you very much again for being with us.
Thank you so much. Hi, everybody. I would have absolutely loved to be there as well, since it's cold this side of the world. I don't know if the weather's better that side. I hope it is. But yeah, good day to everybody. It's a pleasure to sit on this panel. The beauty of being lost is that everybody has kind of said everything. So you just basically come with the nuances that have not really been mentioned. So yeah, I mean, let me start off with certain pointers, and I might be re-echoing them, and they'll set almost like a foundation for the impacts and the implications for the energy transition agenda specifically. I think when it comes to private financing and private capital, the discussions that we've been having, particularly in the context of, you know, the African continent, is that, you know, private finance is not inherently bad. So I think that's one thing that we need to constantly reiterate, because sometimes, particularly as CSOs and think tanks, whenever we speak out against private financing, there's almost this narrative that, you know, it's this bad thing, but it's not. So it's not inherently bad. And in the context of our continent, we don't think it's as terrible. The problem is that private financing has been positioned as this primary solution to development, to energy transitions and climate financing challenges, which is where the problem is. Because the perspective is that, you know, private financing may not, from an intentional point of view, may not necessarily sit and prioritize the development needs that exist in the context of Africa. But also, I'm starting to feel and think, and having worked a lot on public financing, is that there's this promise that, you know, the scaling of private capital is going to materialize, but we've been having this conversation for quite some time. And in the context of the African continent, private capital is not flowing on our continent. So the continued amplification and advocacy for private capital to flow onto the African continent is really not materializing, because again, half of our countries are in junk status, we're debt burdened. The perceived risk of investing in a market like Africa continues to really impact the flow of private capital onto our continent. So it means that the private capital itself, even though it's coming in the context of clean energy, only about 2% gets to Africa. So the consistency or the continued advocacy for private capital to be at the heart of energy transitions or climate or development priorities in Africa is extremely flawed, because it's just not happening. So that's why it's very important for public finance to play such an important role, because we can't have the same conversations about the role of private capital as if, we're sitting in Europe or we're sitting in North America. In the global South, the conversations on private capital investment look completely different. More so, it continues to be channeled to the same country. So in the instance of Africa, we have South Africa, Nigeria, Kenya, Egypt, who constantly get this flow. And it's like, we have a lot of countries on the continent who constantly don't, receive this funding. So therefore, energy transitions are only happening in the instance of those specific countries. And constantly, when we doing case studies and we are giving examples of key countries that are doing the most in terms of energy transitions, it's these very same countries who continue to receive this private capital, meaning that we're not talking about your Chads, your Democratic Republic of Congo. We are not speaking about Seychelles and Comoros. We are really not speaking about countries that are not necessarily within this cream of the crop, countries that constantly receive private capital. So there's that reality. And also private finance tends to prioritize commercially attractive sectors. So countries and projects rather than development priorities. And energy transitions in the instance of Africa is a development priority. There's constant numbers of 600 million people don't have access to electricity, 900 million people don't have access to clean cooking. That's development. We're not just speaking about infrastructure, grids, and all of that stuff. We're speaking about getting access for human development. And private finance doesn't prioritize that. They're rather prioritizing what is commercially attractive sectors and what is more profitable. And rural electrification and those kinds of things are not commercially attractive at all, because the returns are not clear. And also, you need to subsidize heavily the private financing to be able to even get to a point whereby private sector sees the need to enter the market. And the energy, transition requires public finance, concessional finance, and domestic resource mobilization working alongside private capital. And that's why I started with that caveat of private finance is not horrible. We know and understand that it has a role to play, but it cannot be the core and the primary driver of financing energy transitions because of the way and the nature in which it operates. We need the public finance, the concessional financing, and the domestic resources to play a more primary role, and then private capital to also play a role, more so supporting role, caveat role, and maybe even a role whereby public financing is not necessarily coming in. That grid expansion, the market expansion, the green industrialization and circular economy entry, those are the kind of things that they prefer doing, and perhaps that's the role that they ought to play. Now, maybe let me speak to what the implications are in terms of this growing advocacy for private finance. And we're seeing it in the context of Africa. There's the World Bank Mission 300 project. Mission 300 is meant to electrify for 300 million people. There's constant advocacy for private capital. They've mentioned that they want 50% of that financing to come from private capital. There's other projects that, again, the World Bank, the Africa Development Bank, and even in the instance of, government partners, primarily from European countries, is this constant advocacy for private financing. So it's something that we're constantly hearing, but there's also that element of, but private financing doesn't want to come here. So why do we constantly motivate for private financing? Even if we do try and, create bankable projects, try and deal with the debt burdens, the perceived risk on the continent will constantly mean private capital and private financing is not going to flow in the way that it is advocated for. So there's that reality that I think they need to kind of be reminded of. I think the one thing is, so the implications, and let me list them quickly. So one is, private finance obviously follows profitability, not development priorities. And that's what we're seeing on the continent. Investors allocate capital where risk-adjusted returns are the highest. Those key markets will constantly get the financing. Development needs and investment priorities are not always the same thing. More so on the continent, they are barely ever the same thing. So private finance finances what is profitable, not necessarily what is developmental. So things like, utility scale renewables will attract capital, but other things that are key and important for the energy transition, like grid infrastructure, rural electrification, adaptation-related projects, community energy projects, those are really not funded. So therefore, private capital is really selective in what they're funding from an energy transition perspective. And that's why it cannot be at the core of this transition. But also, as I mentioned, the capital is concentrated in the same countries: South Africa, Morocco, Egypt, Kenya, Nigeria. Countries with weaker credit ratings just don't attract financing. Countries that are conflict affected or hard to reach don't get the financing. So it reinforces this inequality of access to capital. So there's inequality in private financing and private capital, unfortunately. And therefore, even countries that have potential, have the labor, have, for example, transition minerals, as long as they're poorly rated, indebted, and possibly have conflict, private capital is likely not going to get into it. Obviously, there's the emergence of funds like Hard to Reach and so forth, but private capital doesn't like going where there's a lot of risk that they need to basically take up first. And we don't want energy transitions to become investor-led. We still want them to be country-led. We still want this to be at the heart of Africa's energy transition, and private sector is unfortunately not going to do that, because now we're starting to see a new question of affordability. Is this very energy that is primarily private sector led affordable to the people? If the new challenge is going to be affordability because private sector is leading it, that's going to be a problem. We can't move from we don't have energy to we can't afford the energy. It just reinforces more problems, and we do want people to be able to access and afford it. So privatization in itself of the energy systems is also potentially a big problem, because we don't want to privatize energy. It's literally what is going to drive industrialization. It's what's going to drive human development. It's what's going to basically improve socioeconomic circumstances of a lot of African countries. And private sector doesn't have that kind of interest, or at least in most of the cases that we've seen. So we hope that in terms of the alternatives, maybe let me speak a bit to that. We hope that, there's elements of definitely the public sector needs to come through. So there's a lot of alternatives that we've spoken about, at least in the context of the African continent. We recently attended the Africa Development Bank meetings, and they spoke about something called NAFAD, which is the new Africa Financial Architecture for Development. The idea is to develop a framework that is going to define what and where and how Africa is going to get financing in this new fragmented financial world. And I don't think anything they've suggested is new. It's just more strategic. Maybe let me name a few of the things they've spoken about. One, obviously, because of the migration patterns in Africa, we have a large diaspora. So they were thinking about how do we get diaspora remittances to fund development and energy transition on the continent? How do we get, from a tax reform perspective, how do we make sure we develop our taxation systems to avoid and reduce illicit financial flows? How do we use our sovereign funds, our pension funds? For example, our pension funds are really big. A lot of our pension funds on the continent are bigger than most European and North and South American countries. So we have very big pension and sovereign wealth funds. There's also aspects of debt. How do we do a lot of the debt restructuring? Because a lot of the countries, GDPs and revenues are going towards, funding these or repayment of the debts. How do we start developing systems that are going to create a good enabling environment? There's the Africa Credit Rating Agency now. We want to rate ourselves because we think the rest of the world is not rating us fairly. There is the Africa Guarantee, to create that element of guarantee. Okay, I see you holding the mic, so let me conclude. Create that element of guarantees or creating guarantees, because there's constant perception that a lot of projects on the continent are not bankable, but also looking at domestic resources. We're constantly looking outside. What does domestic resource mobilization actually look like? I want to give an example, perhaps with Ethiopia. While it's controversial, the dam, the Great Renaissance Dam between Egypt and all of that, one of the most interesting thing about that project was that a big core of that funding was citizens crowdfunding. So it was actually funded by citizens mobilizing their funds and financing that project. So there are all these innovative and strategic ways that we're thinking about. And I think the continent is starting to realize that possibly nobody's coming to save us. So we need to also change in terms of our perception of maybe we need to start financing industrial projects and move away from, the upstream level. We need to get into refining, manufacturing, and not just be the people who provide the minerals and, a lot of the other things where it's all extractive. So I think the continent is really shifting. We can see it in the bans. A lot of countries are banning transition mineral raw, exports, and it's going to happen, and it's going to happen fast. And I think it's exciting times.
Thank you. Thank you very much. For us to hear the African perspective in this conversation. So we are getting very short of time. I allowed the speakers to develop their points quite a lot, and this is my flexible use of moderation power. But and it was difficult that you three were in the virtual room, which is a bit more difficult to manage. But I do want to hear from you, and we started a bit late, so. Let's go for a round of comments. So, Luis, you are the first one in the line. What a surprise. Chiara, yes. Bodo, let's get to someone else. I do want to hear, okay, Mariana, the colleague. Yes, okay. Let's go for this round, and let's try to be brief and ask questions, develop your points, because we do want to give panelists 1 minute for their closing. I am sure that it's going to be possible.
Thanks, everyone. Super useful, unsurprisingly, very good presentation, so thank you. I have a question. I have a comment and then a question. It seems to me that we're dealing with a temporal and sequential problem, right? I know that we can all imagine, I know that the narrative on the fiscal constraints is questionable. I know we can all imagine ways in which those fiscal constraints can be loosened through a series of reforms, right? In tax and in debt framework, et cetera. That said, the political obstacles to making that happen quickly are real, and that's there's a reason why those things haven't been done. And I would argue that they're unlikely to be done anytime soon. So then I think we have a temporal question. What do we do with the fact that indeed there's not enough public finance right now, I would argue, or that private finance has to play a role, right? So then I would ask, particularly Iggy and Daniela, and obviously also Karabo and Andy, are there instances where industrial policy has worked, where the state has been able to discipline capital, and what if that's so? I think, for example, Brazil is an example where the Brazilian Development Bank has been able to do this. There are other examples. So I guess explicitly thinking about what can we do and what are the things? Are there criteria by which the use of private capital should be framed, and how do we conceptualize that in our relationships with the World Bank and IMF and states? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very clear question, but a question that might need a whole panel.
Yeah, then you're not going to be happy about this, because I have a question that is very much related. And it's for Daniela mainly, but actually from everyone else who has a view. And that's exactly the fact that as heterodox economists, we believe that industrial policy is important. It has to do with, the role of the state in helping to create a private sector that, respect a certain number of criteria. And, industrial policy has a lot of using public resources to help private sector develop. That's what subsidies are about. That's a form of de-risking. So in my head, I struggle a little bit in reconciling the criticism that we have of de-risking with the fact that we're actually okay with an active industrial policy. So if you have anything to, reconcile these two things, please, perhaps.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Let's go to Bodo. Very useful question.
Well, my question is a bit simpler, a little more empirical, because my favorite hobby is currently to battle the OECD and European governments on this cost of capital topic. And you criticized private capital mobilization from different angles already. I mean, that the leverage ratio is low, that it doesn't go to the right countries and sectors, that it's not like to development outcomes. But it's very challenging to find data. Also, the OECD doesn't know to what extent it helps to reduce the cost of capital. I mean, all the guarantee instruments, then finance instruments that you mentioned. I mean, do you have evidence on the before and after? Are they effective in reducing the cost of capital or not? To what extent are they effective?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mariana.
Yeah, mine's perhaps maybe a question or a reflection for a whole new workshop, but we've been campaigning so much, kind of pushing back to show how private sector first solutions are not really addressing the needs because of the whole profit conversation. And yet again, we just finished a whole 2 weeks of negotiations in Bonn, where developed countries are still completely refusing to provide a public finance at scale, etc. So any reflections in terms of how we can break the cycle, how can continue to shame them, and how we can really put more to the fore all the economics that we're discussing here in terms of the public realm to overcome that. So any reflections on pointers, I know is the theme to be discussed.
Thank you. Thank you very much. The colleague behind. Yes, please.
Thanks. Less technical, but I think no less important. We've been talking a lot about crossing the river yesterday, and today, Iggy, you brought up kind of imagining the future that we need to get to and how important that is. So my question to you and maybe to the rest of the panel, if you can, is: are there particular movements, institutions, people that are creating or even putting down in words that future right now? And can you highlight them for us so we can also get inspired? Thanks.
Thank you very much, TJ.
Thank you very much. So I want to add some information which I think may be useful. About a year and a half ago, I wrote to the Irish government because I was looking at the amount of funding they had been putting on climate finance. And my question was in the loss and damage fund, whether or not they had brought in fresh funding or were simply reallocating. And they wrote back to me. So if you look onto the website of the mandate, you will see the exchange of letters. And I think it will give you also some idea of what the financing is starting to look like. But also, it's one of the only countries that's actually put money into the loss and damage fund, right? So it's also about intention. So while I was thanking them for doing it, I was also trying to get them to tell me whether or not they were reallocating, and they were very clever in not answering that question. So please read the exchange of letters to get the nuances. But it's been a very interesting panel, and I think that the de-risking challenge is something that we really have to think about, because when you look at sanctions and unilateral coercive measures, which I know we've not really talked about, but it affects some European countries, right? One of the biggest challenges happening in those countries is they no longer have an insurance or reinsurance industry. And so while we're adding the de-risking element into this part of funding, what you're going to start to see is these countries that don't have access to insurance or reinsurance also cannot do the de-risking. So the inequality divide is then going to deepen even within the continent potentially. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Let's go to Maria. And are there any questions from that side of the room? I would like to get, if not the final one from there before going to the panelists. Maria.
Yeah, thanks so much. Really interesting panel. Just to say, I think that we need to have a really clearly evidence-based and constructive approach to this. And the best attempt at that I've seen so far was the Independent Commission of Experts report around FfD that Daniela, you were involved with, and just laid out some principles for private finance done well. And I think we need to be talking in really positive, constructive terms about, like, we know from the evidence that is overwhelmingly clear that this is how private finance can actually contribute to development. It's about getting the right balance of power between state and private investors. It's about using carrot and stick approaches and just laying out that really positive vision.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Any burning final point before going to the panelists? No? Okay, that's great. I think that the point that I want to also make for the panelists to reflect on in their final 1 minute, it's the debt implications of all of that. Because yesterday we started a policy forum with a panel on debt. Next was a panel on tax justice, the work towards the tax body, the convention, etc. So I think that the push for private finance has very particular debt implications and relies on a very unjust distribution of wealth that we are trying to challenge through the work on the global tax body. So with that in mind, let's go on the same order that we had at the beginning. Let's go for Daniela for her closing remarks, E.G., Camille, and Cara. Over to you, Daniela.
Great, thank you. The very interesting questions and the problems I also grapple with. So on I would say two things I would suggest. On the last remark of the expert panel for FfD4 and our suggestions for governing de-risking in a way that, at least minimizes or changes power dynamics, I would say that a battlefront that I would like to join you in opening, if possible, is to fight on the impact metrics. I think it's very important that when we go into, for example, when I talk to European governments who are more open to critiques of de-risking, they say, okay, but give me something to fight with. Not just to say we don't want de-risking because this we cannot do, but give me something to fight with on impact metrics. What kinds of things can we ask DFIs, like Norfund, when Norfund says Lake Turkana wind project is an excellent example of how we do great de-risking, and I say to them, well, it's the opposite. If we had impact metrics that could capture the anti-developmental outcomes of that particular de-risking project, then it would be at least, we can move into governments into at least confronting them with their promises from Seville. That's the one thing. The second thing, to Luis and Chiara, the question of industrial policy and the bigger question of how do we organize industrial policy reminded me, Iggy, very much in agreement with you. I read the World Bank industrial policy report. I'm always very suspicious of the World Bank. When they mainstream our things, you have to be very careful, because these people are never driven by any kind of positive developmental impulses, as far as I'm concerned. And if you read that, and I'm finishing a paper that will probably be out soon in Development and Change, on how do we think about the Wall Street consensus in relationship to the ruins of US hegemony and the US hegemonic project, at least in development. And if you read that, the World Bank report, there is nothing on credit policy, nothing, zero, which is very bizarre, because the 1993 World Bank report that dismissed the East Asian experience of industrial policy is littered with financial repression and credit policy and capital discipline. So we have to ask ourselves, and this, I think, Luis, is a useful way to move beyond there is no fiscal space, or we cannot create the conditions to increase fiscal space. We say, okay, not all developmental or transformative public investment requires fiscal resources. You can do it down the credit policy route. You take control of credit institutions. You use credit institutions like China does now, like East Asian countries did in the past, to impose capital discipline. You can finance transformative ambitions by creating credit locally in smart ways. You don't need to spend fiscal resources on it. I think this is a more constructive, to me, this is a most constructive way to move beyond and to solve Chiara's problem, which is that, yes, you have to give carrots to local capitalists. China does give them gigantic carrots, but you also have to tell them that you use the carrots for my priorities, not for your profits. This is the way forward. And with credit discipline, with credit policy, you can discipline them better. And you also circumvent where is the government going to raise fiscal resources and taxes from. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So let's go to Egypt, please.
Yeah. Just very quickly try to answer especially the industrial policy related questions. Well, the industrial policy and national industrialization in general, it's never escaped the discussions of people's movements and even civil society, especially in the global south. It might not have been like in the most comprehensive form, but it's always been present, especially in the efforts of indigenous peoples against World Bank funded projects. It's in the discussions of farmers for genuine agrarian reform, and these are all related to these can be foundations for industrialization. So it's never escaped the discourse of people's movements. So in terms of sparking inspiration, we look towards the workers that organize themselves, and even we've heard of experiences even of micro, small, and medium enterprises organizing themselves and pushing for a more the mobilization of domestic capital towards the development of larger industries. So there's that. But I'd also like to say that there's no one size fits all for industrial policy. There has to be space given to countries, especially in the global south, who have shared histories of colonization and therefore a shared history as well of their own industries being stunted by private finance and by private capital through policies led by the IMF and the World Bank. And so there has to be space for them to decide on their own how they want to come about in terms of establishing their industries, but with the recognition that it's premised on economic redistribution, on challenging the social dynamics, the national dynamics that are present within their own borders, but with also that recognition, again, going back to the recognition that we have a shared history of colonialism and neo-colonialism. And so also taking into consideration the path towards industrialization, that it's supposed to be premised on policy sovereignty, democratically owned development plans, and also minimizing even the impacts, ecological impacts of the paths towards industrialization. And then I agree that the development paradigm that exists today is a result of an ideological consensus, and so there has to be an alternative to the current ideological consensus, and that means also strengthening the political narrative, to push for the policy outcomes that we need. Okay? I agree. Private financing is not inherently bad, but again, it's not the silver bullet that it presents itself to be. It even admits to its own flaws. Okay? So to advance, I guess, just to end, to advance effective development cooperation and financing, we need really a global architecture that is first and foremost accountable, that answers to the people's interests, the people's needs, and advances democratic governance. It's fit for the purpose of ultimately correcting historical and the continuing economic drains that's happening in the global south and in the rest of the world.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That was very, very good. As a closure, let's go with Hamdi. And Karamo is not online anymore, so we will give you the final word. I hope that you can, go for and go for the last minute. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, I mean, there were a lot of questions, and I think most of them were already addressed. And I'm just gonna try to be centered, like on the EU specifically, because that's my perspective, my role. One thing that is very challenging is basically a little bit. So I hear the structural constraints and just there, but I'm also very interested in the political reality. I mean, like it's so like we were having a conversation 2 weeks ago with the Spanish Development Agency in Brussels, and you told me I didn't talk about Global Gateway, but that representative was like challenging the Commission, asking, okay, what's new about the Global Gateway? We are doing private sector engagement for years. We're investing in impact investment. And this guy was the director of a sort of very progressive country that we all hear of this year, these days, and that we're really happy to hear from, and the Development Cooperation Agency. And he was basically challenging Global Gateway, which we all sort of, call off and see the limits of. He was just saying, well, we are already doing what Global Gateway is doing. So there's nothing new with Global Gateway. So basically, like the thing that I'm struggling with is how given how consensual it is in the political landscape in the European Parliament, so you have nuances between the progressives and the conservatives. So yeah, I think this is the harsh political reality that we have to deal with. And also try to find ways to reclaim what industrial policy means, and reclaim basically the terms of the debate of development cooperation in the EU space, because basically, in terms of if we get stuck in the modalities and we have to make a political case of a development policy, because if we're talking about the tools and the modalities, that's extremely important. But like the EU just doesn't see any incentive for supporting development in the global south and addressing the issues that the colleague was just asking you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think that these also answer Maria's points, right? How we make a very strong case for development, for public funding, and avoid getting into technical traps. avoid getting into an ideological battle that will get us nowhere. Private finance will have a role to play, but the state is the one that has to be in the driving seat to go for a justice-based, right-based agenda. Thank you very much for this panel. It took longer than expected, but I think that the discussion was very rich, hearing different perspectives and opening a lot of avenues for collective work.